Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to this event, which looks very exciting. We're extremely pleased to have Ricardo here virtually with us. This was planned as an in-person event. Unfortunately, we had to move it online, but hopefully we'll get another opportunity to meet with Ricardo because he's currently based at UCL in London. So just before we begin, a couple of housekeeping points. Please, can I ask you to keep your mics on mute because that can sometimes interfere with the sound and the recording. Secondly, that this talk will be recorded. So if you plan to speak and are not happy to be recorded, please get into contact with me or with Tom Ellis, who's also organised this event, and we can make sure that that is removed from the recording. Questions can be written into the chat, or if you prefer, you can wait until the end and raise your hand, and we'll call on you to put your question in person. So this event has been organised by one of the International History Department's research clusters. It's the cluster called Americas in the World, and we're very much interested in thinking about the Americas as a whole. So the group includes people that work on the United States and various parts of Latin America. And the spokesperson of the cluster is Tom Ellis. So do get in touch with him if you have ideas of events or activities that we could become involved with. This event is also co-sponsored by LSE's Latin America and Caribbean Centre, and as such it's another example of the way that international history is quite closely working with the LAC to kind of promote research and events on Latin America at LSE. So I'd like now to introduce our speaker, Ricardo Lopez Pedreros, who is currently Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professor at UCL at the Institute of the Americas. He is a historian of post-colonial and transnational histories of Latin America. His area of specialization focuses on the intersections of labor, class, gender, race, political economy, and political rationality of rule. He's the author of Makers of Democracy, A Transnational History of the Middle Classes in Colombia, which was published by Duke University Press in 2019. We're delighted to have you here today, Ricardo, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start, showing the screen right here. So I think it's working, correct? Yeah, perfect. So I want to express my gratitude to Anna, Tanya, and Tom for organizing this event. I really, appreciate that. I also appreciate the conversation that we have had about, histories of, Latin America. I also want to, thank the Department of International History and the Latin American and Caribbean Center at LSE. I also want to thank everybody attending here, and in particular, I see some of my students here, which of course makes me really happy, but also nervous, right? The pressure from students in my presentation, but I really appreciate, the presence, here. So today I want to talk about, part of my research about, the middle classes, and the last point I'm gonna end up is the other part of the title that I submitted for this conversation, which is the role of elite. So it's a little bit of the what I do in the book that Anna mentioned, Makers of Democracy, but with some questions that have led me to start thinking about the formation of the elites, particularly in Colombia, but in a transnational context. So let me start with brief description of what I want to talk about today, on how I have organized my talk. I'm planning to talk about 40 to 45 minutes here. So I want to talk about three major themes of problematizations. I want to talk about developmental projects, specifically the Alliance for Progress. I want to talk about Cold War politics and politics of radicalization. and the formation of the middle classes in a transnational context, but specifically about Colombia. And I want to start with, Marta Jaramillo's stories, a story of, a sociologist. Then I want to talk about the multiple narratives of how development and specifically the Alliance for Progress are explained, what I call, the notion of, the absence of, the notion of the middle class that may have been but never was. And I will elaborate on that point. Then, Cold War radicalization, the failure of, the middle classes. And then I'm going to make my main points about what I, want to argue about, putting together developmental projects, Cold War radicalization and the middle class, formation. And then I'm going to, ask this question: what difference do the middle classes, make for all of these, histories? And it may well be the case that it makes no difference at all. It may be the, the case, but, most likely I'm going to make the argument, otherwise. So, let me start then with, the story of Marta Jaramillo. To tell you the truth, Marta told me in our conversations, we were neither rich nor poor. Well, maybe we were lower middle class, or more specifically, middle class. Thanks to the Alliance for Progress and the National Front, a bipartisan coalition of the two traditional parties in Colombia, Jaramillo, at the time, a student at UNAL, secured a job at INCORA, the Institute of Agrarian Reform, as a socióloga vivencial, as a sociologist. Jaramillo was not alone. During the late 1950s, early 1960s, sociologists, anthropologists, social workers, agronomists, physicians, and other professionals found jobs with the state thanks to the expansion of the developmental programs, or we may actually call the developmental state. It became almost commonplace for these professional women and men to eventually find a job in state offices, in universities, to prepare, the future of the Colombian nation. In other cases, we'd actually, this developmental office will hire these students to work on ethnographic efforts to know the rural settings of Colombia or the poor neighborhoods in the city. So it is not surprising at all that professionals like Jaramillo remember the Alliance for Progress, perhaps the most important developmental project of the second half of the 20th century in Latin America, as one of the most formative parts of their professional lives. It is, its development programs, Jaramillo recounted, open, and I quote, a world full of modernity, a world of liberty, autonomy, and independence. She detailed the following: imagine I did not have to rely economically on my family or my father. Imagine that. He knew, her father, he knew money was important. That was a huge thing for me. I did not have to get married right away. It did not make sense to me to work hard for a professional degree and just get married and stay home. It made no sense. I became conscientious of who I was. I became a professional woman. I worked hard to make a difference. I had money, and although I had to help my brothers and I had my economic independence, I felt I was doing something very important. That was true for my generation. And yet, as part of the transnational politicization of everyday life during the 1960s in Bogota, many professionals like Jaramillo, they began to question their political and social identification as middle class in an effort to redefine the role in a changing society. Some of these radicalized members of middle classes recall this experience, and more specifically the second half of the 1960s and 1970s, as a moment when they drastically changed what they thought, felt, and dreamed. They began to discuss what they now remember as one of the most important, if unavoidable, questions that the generation have to face. How could they be very much part of the petit bourgeoisie and yet, in seeming contradiction, want to participate in revolutionary movements? Jaramillo, you remember the moment as follows. I had always thought I was very much part of the middle class. Then I realized that I was part of the petit bourgeoisie. Well, you know, it was the 1960s and the world was politically boiling. I read The Old Guy, Marx, and I realized that I was, in fact, as petit bourgeois as one could get. And I was petit bourgeois to the core. Later, I joined the Comandos Camilistas, engaged in liberation theology, and dreamed of a revolution. We kept discussing who we were because we knew all too well, but perhaps too few there to recognize it, that we were petit bourgeois. What else would we be? We read Marx, Lenin, Mao, the Bible, and so many other books that we discussed, and we discussed the so-called petit bourgeoisie vices and virtues. What we should and should not do for the revolution, everything about the petit bourgeoisie, our participation in radical transformation. It was during the boiling and exciting 1960s that I became politically radicalized. I became part of the left, and they became a woman from the left. I, along with men and women like me, wanted a radical social change. At first, I was very naive, but then I radicalized myself. This story, Jaramillo's story, provides or raises some critical questions. How can we actually put together the Alliance from Progress? Again, perhaps the most important developmental project sponsored by the United States, but a transnational project. It was not an imposition by the United States, quite the opposite. It was indeed transnational, being informed from previous projects, developmental projects of the early, the first half of the the 20th century, but with very new things. So how can we actually explain this transition that this Martha's story suggests from the Alliance for Progress to Karl Marx? Why did Martha remember this year as a drastic shift from middle class status to a radical petit bourgeois position? And what did it mean, be petit bourgeois to the core during revolutionary times? And what did it mean to be a woman from the left? As this question suggests, what I want to do here is, as I said earlier, to put together developmental projects like the Alliance for Progress, radicalization of society, as Jaramillo's story suggests, and middle class formation through the gender perspective, to see then what is going to happen with this. But before then I get to the main arguments, I want to contextualize those arguments in terms of some of the historiographical ways of how different historians, social scientists see developmental projects and Cold War radicalization. Let me say at the outset that my work draws on all of the literature that is being produced by some of the members of the audience here. So in some cases, of course, I push some of the the arguments, but I want to make that clear at the outset that I'm in dialogue, even if it is a critical dialogue, with some of these arguments. I'm not reinventing the wheel by any measure here. It is a collective effort, but I want to take a critical stand of some of the ways of how development and political radicalization are explained. So the first one is the developmental project, the Alliance for Progress of the 1960s. The Alliance for Progress, as I said, was a product as a response to the radicalization of societies in Latin America, particularly, of course, the Cuban Revolution, but also the violence of the 1950s in Colombia. This project, as a developmental project, the Alliance for Progress has been seen mostly as a typical policy containment, in which different scholars argue the US wanted to push a ready-made middle class as the political answer to radicalization across, the America. In these arguments, it seems that the middle class, that the US was the example of the middle classes, and they wanted to export that idea, elsewhere, that actually ignores the participation of multiple actors in, Latin America, who actually push for this, developmental project. Now, the second, narrative is to see the alliance as either as a lost cause or a colossal failure. And in this particular, case, we see, the Eurocentric, idea of some of these argument, because scholars said that the mistake, the failure of the Alliance for Progress was that policymakers didn't realize or didn't want to know that Latin America was not Europe. Had they actually, taken into account that Latin America was Europe, then it would have actually, provided different policies. So the mistake they say was that, well, Latin America was not Europe, and precisely because of that, Latin America, because it was Latin America, couldn't create a middle class society, as it was the case supposedly in the United States and in Latin America. The third, narrative is the one that said that, that the alliance had, the best intentions in theory, but that never materialized in practice. This is a very powerful, narrative. And, one that, still very much, shapes some of the ideas as to why this didn't work out. In theory, it looked, pretty nice, but then in practice did not work out. Then we have, the other one is like, the alliance developmental project as a distraction of the real politic or a smoke screen of imperial politics. It's just something, besides the point. Here we have, a good example is the Greg Grandin, his very influential work that defined the Alliance for Progress as merely a program that tried to distract people from what imperial politics was really about. As we will see, my argument is that the Alliance for Progress did not intend to suspend imperial politics. It was actually trying to legitimize imperial politics through developmental projects. And the last one, which is the most interesting one to me, is the one by Arturo Escobar, who says that the Alliance for Progress was the most one of the as a social experiment that a grand design that went sour. And it's interesting to me because Arturo Escobar, along with other decolonial thinkers, they say that the colonial theory is in response to developmental projects. And one has to wonder, if it was a failure, as he suggests here, why then the colonial theories have to respond to something that never worked out in practice? So there are some ideas. Okay, yes. So all of these amount to an idea of the middle class as the measure of the failure, the absence, and the critique of what democracy was or is supposed to be in this developmental project. And so this is the key aspect in this part. Let me read this because this is a central argument here that is very much with us. So let me give you an example here, because all of these narratives about developmental projects serve to protect an ideal account of democracy and the development of a middle class. For instance, in one of the most influential English language textbooks on Colombian history, Frank Safford and Marco Palacio note that, and I quote, despite the growth of urban middle classes during the 20th century, profound social differences still can be observed in a continuing bridge between ideal citizenship and political equality and the reality of continuing privilege and inequalities before the law and justice and the state. So what we see here is that all of these narratives account one idea that the ideal of the Alliance for Progress was supposedly to create a powerful middle class as a representation of democracy, as a representation of citizenship and inclusionary citizenship, and a representation of political equality, law, and justice. Did not work in practice. The critique then is that this account in theory was very powerful, but that was an incomplete enactment. That is to say that in practice did not work out. But in those narratives, then the association between middle classes and democracy remain unquestioned. We still think that then is, the middle classes, we have, once we create the middle classes, then, societies will actually become more democratic. All right, enough about, developmental projects. Now let's move to radicalization, Cold War politics here. As was the case with, developmental projects that also, major narratives about, the middle classes. The middle class as a concept are not absent of these, narratives. It's actually, the way how we describe them. And most of them is, describe them as a failure. Here we have two examples, Greg Grandin again, and Antonio Garcia, major sociologist in Colombia. And they called, the consolidation of anti-democratic politics and society in Colombia was because the middle classes were not, as Europeanized as the one in Europe, or they were not like the United States. And they reproduced what, Antonio Garcia called manorial republic. And I don't know if I'm mispronouncing, that concept, manorial republic, or what, Grandi calls susceptibility to manorialism, which is that the middle classes follow the values, the spirit, the customs of the oligarchs. So that's one, narrative. The next narrative is a more recent one that actually said that, middle classes did indeed, participate as a key actors, as activists in this process of, radicalization. But in this particular case, what we see is that there is, they get identified, but we don't know what is middle class about that radicalization. And I'm going to try to get that later in the talk. The next point is extremely important for me, for the argument I want to make in order to, I don't like to say, rethink, because as I said, I'm not, reinventing the wheel, but let's say, offer a different narrative and explanation, historic explanation of the Cold War based on the case of, Colombia, but that speaks for, the Latin America as a whole. And is, the theory of those, demonios, which is very powerful, particularly for, the right. It's also called, la ley del empate, right? To just, match up what supposedly, the left, did, but with, the state violence or paramilitary violence, did. So in this particular context, what is interesting is that this, the violence associated with the left is seen as the product of an improper middle class in Latin America that was simultaneously the product of, revolutionary voluntarism or youth idealism. The argument goes that, working classes, popular groups, perhaps they were entitled to get radicalized, but middle classes, when they were coming from, privilege, it was just because they wanted to play, to be revolutionary. And that's actually what create the levels of, violence by, the left. So it is an improper, middle class. So from failure to, improper. In the Colombian case, and in the context of, the peace process, this argument has been translated into, two other arguments. The first one is precisely because the middle class was not the proper one, that is to say, to maintain the, supposedly a political position, but rather join forces with, the left. Now they say that, the left overall has a mismatch with, democracy because of middle class participation. And the other one is that the National Front, this coalition of two major traditional parties that consolidate this form of government and not necessarily a dictatorship like elsewhere. Well, the dictatorship of the 1950s supposedly is different. We can actually talk about that in the Q&A. So the National Front, by comparison to other cases in Latin America, was quote unquote better, which then explained the improperness of the middle classes because they were not supposed to get radicalized, because at the end of the day, the National Front was indeed, democratic by comparison to other, places. In all of this, then, we see some narratives that, in my view, don't allow us to think, the middle classes more critically. First, we see then, the Cold War as a dialectical struggle between revolution and counter-revolution, alignment versus counter-alignment, social democracy versus illiberal democracy. So we have these, two camps. And in this particular case, what is the role of the, the middle classes? What we see is this argument is that, the social democracy is mostly coming from, Latin America with, the participation of popular groups or the subaltern groups, and in some cases with, middle classes in, the need to push for revolution, for social, democracy. Then the other camp is the counter, revolution with counter alignment, in which, the middle classes join forces with the oligarchies. In this narrative, the middle class political radicalization, or we could actually say radicalization to the right or to the left, because as we will see, my argument is not that there is no revolution or counter-revolution. I actually argue that there are indeed, these, major political projects. It depends on how we actually want to see them. But then, the middle class political radicalization is seen as alien to the very class formation. That is to say that, be middle class and be radicalized is seen as a contradiction in terms. But as we see with the story of, Marta Jaramillo, suggests something else. For her, it was absolutely clear. There was some question that she needed to ask, but, but for her, middle class radicalization was all, possible. And then we are fixated, as it was the case with, developmental projects, to measure how democratic or undemocratic the middle class have, been. And then the answer, and here we see, for example, with, Greg Grandin, Gilbert Joseph, the idea of, the dependency theory that I'm going to talk about in a minute, the idea that then, the middle classes were anti-democratic because they supported the dictatorship. But the notion of, they were hoping that the middle classes were, more, democratic, as it was supposedly the case of, Europe and the United States. There are some, work that show that that's not necessarily the case, but that's the idea coming from the narratives of, Latin America's Cold War. Then the final one, and perhaps the most important one to me, is the way how the colonial studies remain with this Cold War logic, that the middle classes are either not exotic enough to qualify as part of subaltern alternative, of foundational subaltern identity, right? So the middle classes are not exotic enough to qualify them into that category, so that let's forget them. Let's study them, two classes instead. Or they are close to such subaltern authority, so that the middle classes are not important, because then we can actually see them as properly subaltern. In this particular argument, I see how Cold War logics very much make it into how we see what Latin America is supposed to be. Latin America is supposed to be a subaltern place in the configuration of power in the world. It is here that then I start, thinking about, I won't be able to elaborate, my next project, which is, the histories of the elite formation in Colombia, in order to challenge this particular part of the colonial studies. But I would offer a couple of, suggestions at the end. All right. So to summarize, very quickly, and as you see this wonderful, picture there by the ANUC, a peasant organization in Colombia, early 1970s, around 1970s, produced by, some agronomists in conjunction with, peasants, a critique of the agrarian reform. This picture suggests that we have to put, together the Alliance for Progress alone or in tension with the radicalization and the formation of the middle classes. And if that is the case, then other questions emerge. The first one is, what is the definition of, democracy? That all of these authors that I just reviewed very quickly, I must admit, what definitions of democracy do we often invoke, but barely specify, will label the middle classes as anti-democratic, less democratic, or more democratic? What is the definition of democracy? So then what we see that what we actually have to do is to historicize democracy itself. And the middle classes perhaps become, the vehicle to do, so. The next question with this picture suggests that it's just, what is particularly middle class in terms of the political participation in revolutionary and counter-revolutionary projects. So in both, what is middle class about that? Because we, studies have actually shown the, participation of middle class. In fact, now we say, well, if they're, the middle classes are, for the most part, counter-revolutionary. And we have to ask, what is middle class about that? Because the easy answer is, well, they join forces with, the elites. But let's say, well, what is actually, middle class about that? My proposal, in very basic terms, is that we have to see middle class formation as a social movement of class politics in a context of developmental project. I'm going to try to explain that, now. So what do I say in response to developmental projects? What I say is that, developmental projects of the late 1950s and 1960s, and in particular the Alliance for Progress. Now there is a whole new literature that says the developmental project is the whole 20th century, the century of development. I am not convinced by that, because the notion of development get undefined. We see, okay, it happens during the 20th century, and we don't now have specificity. The specificity of this developmental project is the need to create a middle class society associated with urbanization. The first half of the 20th century, I would argue, was more in terms of the rural part. It's not that it's going to actually disappear, but the subject of democratic politics is going to be seen as middle class urban subject. But the idea of the middle class was one of the most contested fields of knowledge, and you will see a couple of examples in a minute, of the late 1950s and 1960s. Since then, we have created this notion of a bastard middle class, that the middle classes in Latin America are illegitimate, always in comparison to what we perceive to be the middle classes in Europe and the United States. This is modernization theory at its best. To follow up the example of Europe and the United States, the first world create middle class societies. But dependency theories, as we know, a major critique of that argument of modernization theory. But the role of the middle class was unquestioned, because in fact, what dependency theories did say was that the middle classes were anti-democratic because they were not European enough. Jose Nun, for example, argue that they did not have the hegemonic vocation as the middle class in Europe and the United States to create the condition to democratize society. So what I'm trying to do here with these two examples is just to see that this notion of the middle classes as the representation of democracy was a product of knowledge. Very quickly, we have Camilo Torre Restrepo, a major priest in the histories of Colombia, liberation, theology. He participated before he joined the guerrilla in 1965, if I'm not wrong. He was a very active member of creating these developmental projects. And he created, the ESAP with others. And he said that a peaceful revolution in 1961 depended on, the middle classes. And then the next one, you have a famous quote by Arthur Schlesinger, an advisor for John F. Kennedy, also in 1961, who called for a middle class revolution. There were some shared elements of what I call, the conscript of, democracy, that the middle classes were supposed to create democracies in middle class, in Latin American societies. And I am sure you must be thinking, but these are, just theories. These are just, ideas. Some, would actually go as far as to say, this is empty rhetoric. Let's get to the real stuff. Well, let's get to the real stuff then. And that is, these developmental projects create material conditions. It did empower. Tom, I told you that I was going to use the word empower, right? It did empower, endow certain groups as representations of democracy. So here we have a, materially, it did provide, as Marta Jaramillo's stories, state jobs and open up, opportunities and new forms of hierarchization. So, state jobs will be, the task was to professionalize, social relations, or what Alberto Lleras Camargo, the first president of the National Front said, to get social relationships right. Then the expansion of the service, sector. You also, promote new managerial theories in the service sector, in which the idea was that the white collar employee, or the white, actually, the empleado, or what, the notion of worker is exactly what they wanted to question. They say, well, now the middle class is going to represent the reality that we can live in a society beyond, capital and labor. Here we're going to see, some of the most important origins of the ideas of anti-union, because they're going to create that idea that you can actually go beyond capital and labor. And if that's the case, why do you need, a union? And then, the small business owners. These developmental projects create plenty of credit opportunity, most, if not all, credit opportunity for small business owners, most of them men, with the claim that they would actually represent entrepreneurial people. So the Alliance for Progress was a very diverse project, but a central point was to create a middle-class society. And they did create a middle-class society. So far from, weakening, as some of, scholars argue, they actually, create and naturalize a very particular class and racialized gender definition of, democracy. In my book, I go into detail how that actually happened. And it went through, a politics of selection to work for the state. There are major gender elements there that I cannot get into detail, to, process of education. There. So here is just, point that is crucial to me. So this developmental project, with the idea of the middle class, that the middle class would actually, be the democratization of society, it's going to legitimize, it's not going to move things away from imperial politics. It's going to actually legitimize the exercise of US imperial rule as democratic. This part is to locate the case of Colombia in comparison to other cases in Latin America. Of course, Colombia always appeared as an outlier, right? It didn't have, the dictatorship there. I think the way, and the idea is not to say, well, the dictatorships are, democracy. I say here, dictatorship as democracy, or democracy as dictatorship. The connection is, a hierarchized link through the middle class. That is to say that we actually have to think developmental projects as central to the consolidation of dictatorship, military dictatorships in Latin America, and consolidation of democracy, that we can actually see the connection there. In fact, one of the most powerful, since then, legitimation of the US empire was that they were superior democracy because they had developed a middle class. And when they start, the United States government, they start supporting some, dictators throughout, Latin America, they would actually, say, okay, we can actually have a dictatorship supporting the possibility to create a middle class, because that would actually mean democracy. So dictatorship would actually stay in place as long as there were, some support from, the middle classes. So we start, getting into this very difficult, question about dictatorships, the role or the relationship between dictatorship, democracy and developmental project. All right. So for the second part, then, to talk about radicalization, what I try to do here is what I call the motley middle class politics in the case of, Colombia. In contrast to, some of the, arguments put forward by some scholars, I think that, the middle classes were indeed, a very important political subject. So important that what they wanted to, to do was to redefine the very meaning of, politics, or politics as professional, objective politics, as, neutral, right? The ones that could actually, exercise the right to rule, or what I call, the right to rule. But that was one response in terms of, several, because what we see, here is that given that middle class were empowered, they start, making claims to both the Alliance for Progress and to, the National Front for the promises that they were actually, making. So we see the first one, which is, the notion that they wanted to remain apolitical, with the, the case that, oh, we, just professional, they don't want to participate in politics. But there were other groups that joined forces with the ANAPO, the Alianza Nacional Popular, one of the most important oppositional populist groups against the National Front. And the middle class joined forces by saying, well, now we are the people. We represent the people. Neither, the oligarchies nor, the popular classes could actually represent the people. And, ANAPO did indeed respond to that. But there were other, middle classes, men and women, who experienced radicalization here. And yes, I think it's okay. So I have to go back here. It's just, this one, I mistake. Okay. So, but that political radicalization, and here I would actually, say, is particular to Colombia. And that is that, my argument is that radicalization did not come from without, but it was actually within the Alliance for Progress. All of these professionals who are supposed to, train, peasants and workers and even, oligarchs to be, proper leads. It was through those encounters that some of the professionals start radicalizing themselves through the frustration, or what I call, a privileged alienation. Professionals couldn't do what they were supposed to do as representatives of democracy. They start creating a lot of frustration. But at the same time, of course, the inspiration from, the left, broadly understood, play a fundamental role to start, mediating that particular relationship that the Alliance for Progress sanctified, the class, gender, and racial encounters that the Alliance for Progress, sanctify. My main argument here is that this radicalization was not a renunciation of prior gender middle class subjectivities, the one that I just described, but it was a reconfiguration of all of these, interests. So let me, as you see in this particular, picture called The American Dream, a play done by a group of, professors and students at Universidad Nacional in Bogota. You see the gender and the racial elements of, this. So what I want to show, and I'm running out of, time. So what I want to, do here very, quickly is just to see what this radicalization did, or at least, suggests in terms of, the idea or the definition of, democracy. It was a hierarchical project. But when we say that it was a hierarchical project, we also have to recognize what they propose. So let me very briefly go over what radical professionals and white-collar workers did. So if previously white-collar workers was called, employees, now they identify themselves as white-collar workers. Radical professionals, the same, thing. They did propose to redefine the notion of education, not as an investment, but as a common good. They also joined forces to produce what I call subversive epistemology, knowledge production in order to create, a class consciousness, revolutionary, awakening. It is here when we see the origins of post-colonial, decolonial study. That this production of knowledge has some class and gender elements that sometimes we don't want to talk about. Funny enough, the colonial, theory decontextualize the production of knowledge, right? And it becomes, the colonial thinker. There are some material conditions, and it was partially the production of a middle class project. The best example is investigación, acción participativa. But doctors also made the claim of health as a fundamental right, economic success as a collective endeavor, land distribution as predicated on labor, particularly agronomists play a fundamental role. All of them make the claim of public assembly as a central aspect of, democracy. And professional women, nurses, and female, doctors contribute to all of this, but also with notions of, bodily autonomy, or what we can actually call a revolution within, the revolution. They also, fought for equal pay, childcare, service for professional, gender solidarity at home. So here, what I want to, argue is that as they all of these historical actors, as they question oligarchical elites with this version of democracy, this petit bourgeoisie, radical petit bourgeoisie, made the claim to represent the so-called proletariat, and then, assigned themselves the right to rule and dominate in a true democracy. So they redefined the very notion of, democracy, that it was, coming from developmental projects, and yet they made the claim to the right to rule. In this particular case, two arguments are important to highlight. The first one is the gender pacts within the revolution. I have not talked about the question of counter-revolution. I don't have the time, but that's the end of the story, how some of the, counter revolution is going to actually win out over these particular definitions of, democracy. But there was some gender pacts, and this is, a central, part, because there are going to be those gender pacts in terms of what many petit bourgeoisie men thought it was the right to rule assigned to men as their own prerogative. With all of these, challenges of, democracy, what we see that as radical petit bourgeoisie, they made that particular claim. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that women did not participate. Of course, they did participate in making the revolution more expansive, here. But the question then remains, and here this is just something that recent studies have actually done, have called more history from below in order to start, radicalization and cold war radical, politics. But I think that's very important. But my argument is that we actually have to see, just the last one, I'm almost done, but we also have to see the struggle within, the revolutionary, projects. What vision of revolutionary project actually won out over other, versions of revolutionary projects. So it's not only to reclaim history from below. That's a key part. but we also have to explain why certain versions of, revolutionary change didn't make it in terms of what the revolution was supposed to deliver. In conclusion, then, why all of this is important, if important at all. The first one then is to understand the Cold War politics as a struggle between a more heterogeneous class, gender, and racialized mobilization happening within revolutionary and counter-revolutionary movement. Granted, I have actually done only the former, through which comparing conceptions of class rule as well as opposing forms of domination were contested and legitimized. The second one is to understand development as a particular methodology of democratization as domination. So in this particular case, then, as I said, what is the relationship between democracies and dictatorships in this specific historical moment? The connection, what it makes possible that comparison is indeed the developmental, project, because in both of them, the notion of middle class appears as the possibility to the claims to what they think democracy is supposed to, deliver. The other element that is important for us with this interpretation is to go beyond the Cold War politics and to see that two-class society is not just the only or the authentic, unique struggle of our times. If you don't remember anything else from this talk, please remember this. When we study the middle classes, we are studying histories of domination that often get called as democracies. That's what I've actually, been trying to do. That's what I wrote the book about, the middle classes in Colombia, to write a history of domination, with the middle classes at the core of that. So, but that idea, powerful idea that comes itself from the 1960s and 1970s, that the main struggle is just two class and the authentic one, right? That reads the subalternity of, Latin America. I don't think that's the only one. We actually have to, let's say, pluralize the, the way how we understand, domination. Because then, the last 2 points I promised is that, democracy then becomes the topic. Democracy becomes what we have to question instead of, taking for granted. And see then, the definition of democracy that we actually have in mind sometimes to, to say, well, that's democracy or that's not. Let's democratize, this process is in itself a historical, formation. Obvious enough, but in order to show it, it takes a lot of, work in order to denaturalize notions of what, democracy is supposed to do. Because of course, from the present, who is going to actually, say that it's not, better to have a society defined, but, three-class societies in which the middle class is very expansive instead of, two-class, society. The answer is quite obvious. Of course, it's better to have a, an expansive middle class. But there, let's think about what kind of democracy is being, celebrated. There are other arguments that I would like to, elaborate, but perhaps in the Q&A. But I'm gonna, stop, right there. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. That was a really fascinating talk. And I really loved the images you used. So it'd be great if you could talk about those perhaps in the Q&A. I can see some hands up already. So if I say your name, then hands have gone down. I see Lizzie would like to pose a question if you'd like to unmute yourself. Oh,
hi, Anna, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I'm actually still a little sick. That was a clap hand. Ricardo, thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful. Yeah, I'll mute myself again, but I'm coming in fairly sick. Thank you.
Okay, I'll ask an opening question then, because you mentioned race in passing, and so I was wondering, sort of, if you could talk a bit about who was allowed into the middle class? What were the mechanisms of exclusion? And one of the parts I enjoyed most about your book was when you talk about the kind of the interview process for people that became involved in these Alliance for Progress agencies and institutions. And I wondered if there were more examples of kind of gatekeeping and mechanisms of exclusion.
Yeah, this is a very tricky question. So let me answer this in 3 ways. So in terms of what developmental projects, imagine these a democratic subjects. They imagine the notion of mestizo. That's one discourse about race as racial harmony. So the middle classes will create class harmony. So simultaneously with actually, the notion of mestizo, so the idea, the normative notion of middle classness was associated in most cases with the notion of mestizo, and then the association with other racial groups as representing particular interests. So the mestizo would actually be universal. Middle classes would actually be universal. And the combination of both that would actually be democratic. So that in terms of the discourse, and here is it's very interesting because Gutierrez, Virginia Gutierrez de Pineda, perhaps one of the most important anthropologists in Colombia, in conversation with other authors, she actually made the case to see how, for example, entrepreneurial people, there were some what she called cultural elements that at the moment were associated also with notions of human capital. So she regionalized and racialized the notion of middle classness. And in some cases it was associated with whiteness, specifically the case of Medellin, but also Bogota. And she associated Bogota with the mestizo, and Medellin and Antioquia with whiteness. So there are major racial elements. And the third part that is for me fascinating is that decolonial theory does reproduce some of those arguments, because when they imagine Latin America as subaltern, they associate middle class with Europe and the United States. So that then they think of that as white. They imagine that as a middle class society. So it's very interesting because it get reproduced. Now, in terms of the politics of inclusion and exclusion, things are very tricky. But I would actually say that it remained, the notion of the mestizo remain as the way how professionals could actually be professional, quote unquote, objective. They wouldn't necessarily be responding to a particular interest in terms of race. The case of teachers is very interesting. Here the work by Mara Viveros is quite illuminating in that sense, because a lot of teachers, maestras, that they're not going to participate in FECODE. A lot of people of African descent, Afro-Colombians, were able to participate in that group. But what's interesting is that they were not seen as part of the middle classes, despite the fact that they could actually be part, let's say, economically speaking. So race plays a fundamental role. And interestingly enough, the revolutionary projects did reproduce that part. Elsewhere, I elaborate the case of Jose Raquel Mercado, a Black working class leader from Cartagena, when that being one of the major the leaders of one of the major unions in Colombia. And I show how the M19 create all of these racialized ideas in order to, at the end, execute him as a improper, what I call improper proletariat. But that notion of improper also has some elements of race and gender. So here you see that then there are some meeting points on what we otherwise would actually see two opposite political projects. But we also have to recognize that we're two opposite political projects, but with meeting points.
Thank you. Sorry, we have a question from Gisela Carlos Fonseca. Sorry, Fregoso.
Hi, Ricardo. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I wanted to ask you, what is the role of education, of course, and well, you already said that social capital and the capitals are very important. But I was thinking in the case of the narcotráfico here in Mexico, where I live, that here in the west of Mexico, Guadalajara, Jalisco, there are studies that tell us that even if they've got a lot of money, they cannot be middle class, because the middle class is a question of, you know, something else. Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, what would you say about it? Yeah, what's the role, you know, in the case that you're studying the education and the capitals and the money, how they, you know, se contrarrestan, I don't know, yeah. Something like that. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Isela. It's a very interesting, you know, question. What's the name of the movie maker? Gaviria. I forget the first name. Anyway, so he has a very interesting movie that is the story of an engineering who ends up, you know, being part of, you know, the drug, you know, business. But what is interesting is that, yes, they could actually, you know, be part of the middle class in terms of, you know, material wealth, but in terms of what they, you know, the way how they are seen, they are not. But these are actually, you know, the sumas y restas. Thank you very much. You know, the struggles are always, you know, happening in order to define the boundaries of what a proper middle class are all about. In some cases, it is indeed possible that, you know, drug business would make the claim to a middle class identity for a very powerful idea, the notion of the entrepreneurial person. It is through those discourses and not through the notion of, you know, education or cultural capital that some people that, you know, belong to the drug business can actually make a claim both to, you know, belong to the middle classes or sometimes even to, you know, the elite. The elite's a little bit more complicated because it has to do with, you know, the access to political power. But it is then, you know, the notion of entrepreneurial, because it's so central to a capitalist, you know, enterprise that it's almost impossible not to say that, well, you know, I'm coming from, you know, humble origins, which is the main, you know, sometimes the main story also of drug business. And I made it to, you know, middle class. So that notion of, you know, entrepreneurial self is so powerful that sometimes cannot be, you know, denied. Then, of course, you have the morality attached to the drug, you know, business, because of course, this a capitalist, you know, capitalist system, but then, you know, the notion of morality starts excluding who belongs to the proper middle class. And as I said, you know, in my presentation, it has that notion of properness, which, by the way, is almost impossible to translate it into Spanish. That notion of properness just gives me a headache, but it captures that notion of goodness in terms of what represents some, you know, democracy. And that's precisely why, in some cases, it's impossible for some people that, you know, achieve that status economically from drug business to make that claim, because it has, you know, that sanctity of middle classness attached to, you know, to democracy. So, but all of these elements are always in flux, and that, you know, defining the different, you know, boundaries, because in so many cases, you can actually get a lot of money from drug business and then clean up your background through education, right? So, and then it's like, you know, what you don't talk about where the money is coming from, but you can actually, you know, get your, you know, family trained in, you know, elite universities, and then you get to that cultural capital, social capital as well. So, but I would actually say we have to write a book about that, because that would allow us, you know, to say what is wrong with, you know, the drug business. It's a capitalist system. So what's wrong with it, right? So, but there are a couple of examples, you know, there for the Colombian case that I think are important. I'm thinking of the work of, you know, Lina Brito as well. So, thank you.
So I mentioned the images that you used in the presentation. Where did you come across these in your archival research?
Okay, so the very last one, the conclusion, that's hopefully the cover for the Spanish version of the book, and it is a visual depiction of some of the arguments by a couple of artists from Colombia. So they read the book, and we talk about it, and that's the depiction of the arguments of the tide, the hierarchies, the exclusion of people of Africa, descent, the relationship, of the labor relationship in offices, and so it's a depiction of that. Well, some of the images that I use come from a company's archives. That's actually one, and what I mean is like major like insurance company. I'm talking about the Banco de la República, so the major service companies. I had access to some of the the archives, looking up. So some of them come from that. The others come from a labor unions making a claim to radicalize themselves, the right to protest, and others what I call imperial transnational archives, which are the archives of the developmental projects, usually combined with state projects, and also the archives of major elite intellectuals, Virginia Gutierrez de Pineda, Orlando Falsborda, and others. But they use a lot of images to train professionals on how to be proper rulers. And the last one is from personal archives, particularly the one that I used there with John F. Kennedy. That's from an archive of a sociologist that I'm writing, a biography, Gabriel Restrepo. He has an amazing archive, and there that's part of a play. But the pictures become available. It's a critique of the so-called American dream associated with the physicality of the American dream, and they making the claim that they as petit bourgeoisie, they think it's all about thinking, it's all about education, it's all about intellectual labor, and not the United States associated with physicality and all of those things that are supposedly not important. And the other one is indeed the racialization and the role of gender in terms of who they imagine themselves to be as rulers as part of this radicalization.
Tanya, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I'm still digesting. There was a lot there to think about. Very thought-provoking kind of ideas about how to kind of upend many of the ways we think about democracy and the middle classes as well. I've got two questions, I guess. One is about comparisons that the Colombian middle class are making with other middle classes elsewhere. You've talked quite a lot about how those behind the Alliance for Progress were imagining the Latin American middle class as proper, improper, but to what extent are the Colombians themselves, or either within the middle class or those outside the middle class, are they imagining middle classes in Europe or in the US or perhaps in other contexts as well? And the other question is about the Cold War and where this fits, because I feel like in a sense you describe the middle classes as a weapon of the Cold War or as an object of the Cold War, as the Cold War happening within the middle classes. And I mean, it might be that it's all of the above, right? But I just, is the middle class, can we call the middle class a unitary actor in the Cold War or a unitary object of the Cold War? Are we, one thing that's really striking, I thought was interesting, is that Jaramillo's story told a particular journey, but presumably there were other journeys in other directions, right?
Yes.
So I wondered if you could maybe talk through that relationship with the Cold War, or if you could help me kind of work out, how this relates, if at all, to a kind of Cold War narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh,
I was going to say it's certainly of the Cold War. It's certainly in the Cold War, but I wondered if there were other ways of thinking about this. Thank you, though.
No, thank you very much, Tanya, for those, difficult questions. Let me start with, the last one. Yeah, I mean, it's even within, this revolutionary, politics, that, several, stories. And, I privilege this one because it allowed me to have, this relationship between developmental projects and Cold War. But yes, there were, other stories. Even some that actually, deny the role of, developmental projects. Because historically speaking, once you identify with, developmental projects, the genealogy is to say, oh, shoot, I'm part of the empire then? Yeah, that's like indeed, question. And I have to say that in some cases that became a very difficult question, to the point that, a couple of interviews, that was indeed the end of the interview. In those cases, radicalization appears in a completely different light. The radicalization is very much part of radicalization itself. Well, it was the 1960s, it was the 1970s. Everybody, you could actually, smell it. That would actually be one story. But interestingly enough, these people were also, in these cases, university professors from public universities. You could actually, trace, developmental projects, money to the university. So in that case, then it's more of an unconscious formation of, middle class, or even the denial. So that is actually, one. Then you see the elements of, gender. So we see multiple, middle classes. Then if we move to the camp of counter-revolutionary, we, the last chapter of the book is trying to explain what version of middle class actually wins out over this particular one. And that story, when we talk about memory, is that they remember the 1960s and 1970s. They ignore, what we may consider the Cold War altogether. Radicalization, none of that. Politicization, nothing. They imagine themselves as, entrepreneurial, selves. So they tell you the story of, look, I came from this, background, and I made it. And let me tell you the story of what it was. So what I call very neoliberal memories. And with those neoliberal memories, they're also, let's say, dissident, memories within neoliberal, memories. The other camp, you also see, dominant memories and, dissident memories. And they all speak of, the different trajectories of these, people. But to connect it to the next point, Tanya, I do make the argument that we can actually talk about the middle classes as a class. In the literature about the middle classes, one of the things coming precisely from the 1960s and 1970s is that middle classes cannot be seen as a class because they have full conscientiousness, because they have no political, coherent political project, so they cannot be a class. And it's very, fuzzy in terms of, what they to locate them. My argument is that if we actually include and take seriously the questions of gender and race, then we can actually talk about, middle classes, because the notion of gender gave a notion of communality, particularly for men, to make the claim to the right to rule. The next part is to see how that actually create gender pacts across classes. And so I actually say that we can, talk about that as a class, because there's a level of, communality that doesn't necessarily mean that they homogenize their political projects, but there is a level of, sharing, a political project with, heterogeneous, interests. And the last point I would actually, make is that and this is, part of the larger project, is that if we include the notion of the unconscious, or what I call hierarchical unconscious, as a central element of class formation, then we can actually talk about middle classes as sharing political projects. So all of that amount to that we can, we can actually think about middle class subjects, as part of the Cold War, understood as, or I will define the Cold War as, the struggle over the meaning, the practices, and the institutions of, democracy. So that's what I said. And finally, for the first question, very quickly, a lot of connections with, Europe and, the United States in terms of the political projects. I couldn't do that in the book. I needed to finish the book. The book was long enough, but that's what I'm working on right now. The connections between middle classes across national states, because I like to think at this point, we know that the nation state, with all of these transnational studies, has shown that, the state is not perhaps the principal organizer of identities. But my argument is, okay, if it is not the nation state, then what is it? And I would actually say it's class combined with questions of gender and race. And that's the connections with, other places that we can ask, another layer of that argument that we can actually talk about, middle classes as a class, with, of course, gender and race elements.
Thanks, Ricardo. We have a question in the chat, which is about Gaitan. So was Gaitan's political goal to build a made in Colombia middle class? And if so, was this a threat to US and Western interests?
Yes, Gaitan had a whole project of, creating a middle class, but specifically with state employees. So they, state employees call themselves as, we are part of, the people. Somos parte del pueblo. And Gaitan himself, would actually say, yes, that's indeed, the case. So Gaitan did try to create, a political following with, the middle classes. Interestingly, this is a very interesting question, because in the 1950s, the developmental theory are going to see the participation of middle classes in what they consider, anti-democratic, a populist movement, as the manifestation that there was something wrong with the middle classes in Latin America. So they would actually, cite the example of course, Perón would actually, be one. The role of, the middle classes during La Violencia in 1950, it would actually, be Gaitan and the participation of, the middle classes that supposedly did not, prevent violence from happening because they side with, political positions, which was, anti-democratic, populist. So the Alliance for Progress is in fact a form of a response to the political participation of, some middle classes, particularly, the employees in the politicization of, Latin America. The other example was, Guatemala. If we read the reports, the State Department of 1954 coup d'etat, they're amazing because they assign the political agency to middle classes, just to say they are improper, they're a bastard middle class. The same with Cuba. They would actually make a class and racialized argument. They would say, it's impossible that peasants or workers in Guatemala are going to be able to, support this person. They have no idea what politics are all about. They care about, everyday life, but that's it. So it's only the middle classes, the argument went, they could actually have this political position. And it was read as improper, or what I refer to as, a bastard, illegitimate, middle class that need to be educated. And that's what, the project of the Alliance for Progress was all about, to educate a proper middle class for a proper, democracy. And interesting enough, we are still stuck with that argument. The middle class in Latin America are always seen as lacking something, as catching up with, the model of, the middle classes elsewhere. And what we actually have to do, and I'm going to do that, in another talk, is how those ideas became so ingrained in the way how we understand, middle classes in, scholarship.
Thanks, Ricardo. We still have 10 minutes remaining, so do please put your questions in the chat if you have any questions that you're thinking of. In the meantime, I wonder if you could kind of bring us up to date about sort of ongoing politics in Colombia and where class fits now. It strikes me that the sort of class divide or wealth divide is possibly more stark now than it was during the 1950s and 60s. And what impact does that then have on the role of class in democracy?
Okay, yeah. All right, so I only have 10 minutes, right? No, I mean, very, very, very quickly, because a point that I couldn't make because I did, run out of time, is that, so I'm going to answer this question in two ways. The first one is, in relationship to, the peace process, and then, the recent mobilizations in Colombia. So for the former, one of the very interesting things here is that in terms of, truth and reconciliation, the middle classes never have a political responsibility, precisely because what I argue in my talk, because they always, see, or we always see the middle classes either belonging to, the elites or, the popular groups. So they have no political responsibility. What I show in the book is that once a definition of democracy predicated on what I call, a neoliberal middle class, we then see the connection of a middle class formation with the paramilitarization of, society in Latin America, and how middle class themselves have actually participated directly and indirectly in the perpetuation of the social, political, and armed conflict of Colombia. So we have to take, middle classes outside that idea that, they are in a historical bubble, that they don't have, political participation in terms of power relationships. What I try to show in my book is that they have actually participated in, the political, power, and they have created a system that they call and defend, as democracy, that has partially justified the conflict and the levels of, violence. One of the things that I do in the last, chapter is how middle classes become victims of, the violence, perpetrators, and also implicated subjects, all at once. So, but they are centered to, the question of how we can actually achieve, peace. The second part is, the social movements or mobilizations. The middle classes have been on the streets, I would argue. But all of these middle classes, one of them, I would argue, is that, there are middle classes on the street, yeah, I would say reclaiming or requesting or demanding more neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism, what happens is that, they made the promise, and up to the 1990s, some of the promises were materially met. But since then, things have actually gone, south. So that's actually one of the protests. What happens is like, sometimes we look together all what, the social mobilization mean. But there are other middle classes, so we could actually associate the one that we have talked about, today, the radical middle classes that make a claim to a more expansive, democracy, particularly with the notion of education as a common good, as I discussed today. And there are way more, radical ones that imagine, democracy or the radicalization of, democracy. But you see, the opposite middle classes too, the so-called, quote unquote, gente de bien, that make the claim to the paramilitarization of society in order to defend a notion of peace as violence, to protect, who they think they are, to defend what they think democracy ought to deliver. They do not see a contradiction between peace and violence, precisely because they think that, the middle classes are, the representation of democracy. So they make the claim, actually drawing on ideas of, paramilitarization of society, that in order to achieve peace, you need to legitimize multiple forms of, violence. So that's one of the main reasons we see people, for example, in Cali or in Bogota or in other, cities, making that particular, claim that they have the right to defend, themselves and legitimize that forms of violence. So they see peace as violence and democracy as, violence as well, as a form of legitimacy to exercise violence.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a bit of a mean one to throw you at the end. Very complex question. Okay, do we have any final questions? Okay, if not, I hope you all join with me in thanking Ricardo for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Engaging discussion.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you in person very soon.